All right, Chad. I wanted to show you this article written by Nate Silver.
Mike. I don't know who you are. I don't know where you are. But your name wanna start changing your ways.
Nate Silver says Mike is right about 538. Now, I don't know if you guys remember, but a day or two ago, I ripped 538's model apart. And I said it's fucking garbage. And it's fucking bugged. And there's something wrong with it. And it doesn't make any sense. And it's useless. And when Ron Klain and the Biden White House were like, look, we're winning on the 538 model. And I had a fucking freak out. What do you think about legal challenges by the GOP that AOC brought up? She doesn't understand the law. Which is an embarrassing flub. There is no Democratic nominee. We're not replacing a Democratic nominee. Joe Biden is the presumptive Democratic nominee. The Democratic nominee is determined at the Democratic National Convention, not before. So there's no one to replace. There's no legal challenges. She's wrong. There's only legal challenges if the convention drags on beyond its planned end date, which is a possibility that could occur, but I hope it won't. So assuming the convention ends when it's expected to end, which is you have to assume a lot of things before you get into a problem. And by the way, Democrats control, for example, the first deadline is Michigan. Democrats control both chambers and the governor's mansion. They could change their deadline. Wouldn't she know? That's her job. Just because people are supposed to know something doesn't mean they do. All right. Why I don't buy 538's new election model. It barely pays attention to the polls and the results just don't make a lot of sense. Nate Silver. When the Silver Bulletin presidential forecast launched last month, I said I wasn't interested in prosecuting model wars, meaning having big public debates about forecasting methodology. One reason is that I find these arguments tiresome. I first published an election model in 2008, and it's been the same debates pretty much ever since. But there's also a more pragmatic consideration. If I think a model is unsound, I worry about elevating it by giving it more attention. Because I do believe in probabilities after all. Joe Biden's chance of winning another term is hard to forecast because he might still drop out, and he's probably not capable of running the sort of normal campaign the model implicitly assumes he can. Biden's chances are probably lower than the current 28% in the Silver Bulletin forecast. In other words, but they're certainly not zero. I worry about a news cycle on November 6th when an unsound model is validated because it won the model wars based on a sample size of one election. What also makes this awkward is that the model I'm going to criticize comes from the site I used to work for, 538. I'm sure newsletter readers know this, but what was formerly the 538 model from 2008 to 2022 is now the Silver Bulletin model. I retained the IP when I left Disney. But I'm not sure the rest of the world knows that. I still sometimes run into people who think 538 is affiliated with the New York Times, which hasn't been since 2013. I worry a little bit about a Naomi Klein, Naomi Wolf situation in which criticism of the 538 model rebounds back on me. Let's also state the other more obvious conflicts here. I publish a competing product. I'm not a fan of the guy 538 hired to develop its new model, G. Elliott Morris. However, various high-profile reporters have contacted me for comment, and I think I have a professional obligation to speak up. Not all that many people have explored the inner workings of models like these. Moreover, we're in an unusual circumstance where the models themselves have become part of the debate about what Biden should do. For instance, the 538 model, which showed Biden with a 53% chance of winning as of Thursday afternoon, has been cited by Biden defenders like Ron Klain, the former White House chief of staff, as a reason that Biden should stay in the race. I thought he had no path, according to donors and the electeds following the donors. Electoral college odds, 538, Biden 277, Trump 261. I'm not sure that Klain or anyone else should get their hopes up from the 538 model, however. At best, all it's really saying is that Biden will probably win because he's an incumbent. The polls have very little influence on the 538 forecast at this point, and at worst, it might be buggy. It's not easy to understand what it's doing or why it's doing it. I thought the 538 model seemed basically reasonable when it was first published in June, showing the race as a toss-up, but its behavior since the debate, Biden has actually gained ground in their forecast over the past few weeks, even though their polling average has moved toward Trump by 2 points. It raises a lot of questions. This may be design. Morris seems to believe it's too early to really look at the polls at all, but if my model was behaving like this, I'd be concerned. Moreover, some of the internal workings of the model are strange, or at least appear that way based on the information Morris has made publicly available. In the Silver Bulletin model, we take steps that are roughly similar to the 538 model. First, we take a snapshot of the race, which is based on polling, although with some fancy adjustments to smooth out the data in states where there isn't much polling, and then regress it toward a prior based on fundamentals, which in our case consists of the economy and incumbency. Right now, for instance, Biden trails by 2 points nationally in our polling-based estimate, but our fundamentals forecast says he should eventually win the popular vote by roughly 2.5 points. Currently, our model uses a 70-30 blend of the snapshot and the fundamentals. So even in Nate Silver's bulletin, he's kind of ignoring the polls a little bit. He's pushing Biden up according to the fundamentals that he has in his model. But in the Silver model, the polls are the dominant factor. So in other words, 70% of his forecast is the polling, and 30% of his forecast is the fundamentals model he has, which shows, according to him, his model shows Donald Trump winning the national popular vote in November by 0.6%. Blending the polls and fundamentals yields a mix where Biden is projected to lose the popular vote by 0.6 points. Not so bad, actually, but keep in mind that Biden's electoral position is considerably worse than his standing in the popular vote. Still, I hope the logic is reasonably easy to follow. The reason why this is the way people are distributed over the country. Democrats have an electoral college disadvantage, meaning Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania are more red than the country as a whole. So in other words, to win the electoral college, a Democrat has to outperform in those states. They can't just win the popular vote by 1 vote. They have to win the popular vote by a significant amount because those states are more conservative than the country as a whole, and they have all the electoral college votes to actually get to 270. So to win the election, you have to beat your opponent as a Democrat by 4 or 5 points. So if you lose the popular vote as a Democrat, you definitely are losing the election. But if you're a Republican and you lose the popular vote, you still have a shot. Still, though, I hope the logic is reasonably easy to follow. Our final forecast reflects a blend of polls and fundamentals. By contrast, look at 538's forecast in Wisconsin. I looked at this exact thing. This is so funny. Did Nate Silver watch my stream? Or do I just know what I'm talking about? 538 projects Trump to lead the polling average by 2.7 points in Wisconsin on election day. And it thinks the fundamentals basically show a tie. Biden ahead, but only by 0.2 points. And yet somehow it predicts Biden to win by 1.3 points in their full forecast. That doesn't make a lot of sense. So in other words, how could their fundamentals only forecast plus their polling average equal a number that's greater than the fundamentals? That's impossible. What's going on here? This doesn't math. Now, to be fair, this isn't happening with 538's national numbers. Here, their full forecast is Biden plus 2.6, which is somewhere in between the polls, Trump plus 1.9, and fundamentals, Biden 3.3. Now, if you're asking yourself, Mike, why are you reading this whole thing? Because this is one of the most important factors for arguing against Biden right now. You need to be able to thoroughly debug 538. I've seen people arguing in favor of Biden not stepping down literally use 538, and there's 2 things they use. That stupid Keys guy, what's his fucking name? The guy who got the 2000 election wrong and the 2016 election wrong, but says he never got any elections wrong. Alan Lichtman. Yeah, the Lichtman Keys. Do you see the Lichtman Keys being used as an argument, which is a charlatan and a fucking joke? And 538's model being used to show Biden is actually ahead. Those 2 things are charlatans and they're fucking stupid. So you need to be able to thoroughly debunk them. They're dumb as fuck. So that's why we're reading this. It's not that long, so we're going to keep going. So that's internally consistent, at least. They're obviously leaning more heavily to the fundamentals than the polls, though. Whereas our mix is roughly 70-30 in favor of polls. Theirs is about 1585 in favor of fundamentals. Now, that could at least theoretically be correct if they think the fundamentals are a more reliable indicator. The problem is they don't seem to think that, or at least not based on this chart they published. Look at the error bar for their fundamentals only forecast. It's incredibly wide, notably larger than the error for their polling component. In fact, the 95th percentile probability distribution on their fundamentals estimate covers everything from Trump by 20 to Biden by 30. Does anybody think those are reasonable ranges? Does anybody think it's reasonable that Biden is going to win the popular vote by 30 points? Does anybody think it's possible that Trump wins by 20 points? That's insane. Results that are nearly impossible in today's highly polarized political environment. So the chart is telling us that Morris doesn't think the fundamentals are very informative at all. And yet his model seemingly assigns 85% of the weight to the fundamentals. I'm going to use the words like seemingly a lot because a lack of transparency of what the 538 model is actually doing. As a principle of model design, it's almost axiomatic that if you're blending two or more components into an average, you want to place more weight on the more reliable component. But they're doing just the opposite. It also doesn't explain what's going on in Wisconsin or other states like Ohio, where, to repeat, 538 has Biden doing much better in their full forecast than in either the polls or the fundamentals. The explanation that Morris has... Let's go look at that real quick. Like, this is actually one of the most pathetic things I've ever seen in my life, that people believe this. Like, let's go to Ohio. He has Biden winning 20 times out of 100. This is batshit crazy. Ohio is totally lost. There is no shot that Joe Biden wins Ohio. This is an impossibility. The polling average has Biden up Trump up 9.6. There's not a 20% chance of fucking Biden winning Ohio. This is nonsense. This is nonsense. But somehow, their full forecast, look how wide these error bars are. All the way from almost Trump winning by like 24 to Biden winning by 5. What the fuck is this? And somehow the full forecast, which is a combination of polling average on election day plus fundamentals only forecast, is more to the left than either one of those components. What are you doing here? Is there a negative number somewhere? Like, how is this happening? This doesn't make sense. This is crazy. The math doesn't math. It also doesn't explain what's going on in Wisconsin or in states like Ohio, where, to repeat, 538 has Biden doing much better in their full forecast than in either the polls or the fundamentals. The explanation that Morris has given for this discrepancy is jargony and hard to parse. I might do a follow-up post where I try my best, but I'm reluctant to do his work for him. He claims to be too busy to provide a longer explanation. Now, chat, he says he's working, quote, 12-hour days. So something super thorough will have to wait a bit. Now, it's important to understand something, chat. G. Elliott Morris is like 24 years old, and he's the editorial director of data analytics at ABC News and 538. A 24-year-old fresh out of college is the editorial director of data analytics. How? Nepotism because people liked him on Twitter from 2018 and 2019, literally. He used to be a data post, like a polling a poster on Twitter. I used to reply to him frequently because he was making basic errors. Like, for example, they had a congressional forecast in 2019 or 2018, and they had all the congressional districts of Pennsylvania wrong. And I was like, these are the wrong congressional districts. You guys are basing your model on the wrong congressional districts. Please update these congressional districts. They were profoundly incompetent. But because somebody liked him on Twitter, he's now got this job, which is fucking incredible. But what everyone is, so far what he's written has raises as many questions as it answers. But what everyone should know is that statistical models like these are complex and can very easily go wrong. Models can contain coding errors, like say flipping a plus sign for a minus sign, or could suffer from incorrect data, e.g. mistakenly inputting an Alabama poll as an Arizona poll. But more than that, models have a lot of complicated components, and if you aren't careful, they can be less than the sum of their parts. Moreover, it's hard to detect these design flaws through backtesting alone. Usually you only learn the hard way once the model is stress tested under real-world conditions. Because Morris's model is new this year, it hasn't endured one of those tests yet. It's like a bit like thinking you've engineered a good car, but for some reason the first time you test drive it, it continuously drifts to the left-hand side of the road and won't go faster than 45 miles per hour. Sorry, but it's time to go back to the lab when that sort of things happen and not pass off a bug as a feature. It's actually good that you can only go 45 miles per hour because you'll get in fewer accidents that way. However, even if 538's model is working as intended, I don't think it's informing us of much. Its thesis is basically this. Joe Biden is a reasonably clear favorite to win the popular vote because he's an incumbent, and it's too early to really update that assumption based on the polling or anything else. Indeed, you shouldn't really think of the 538 model as a polling-based model at all, given that their forecast has actually moved in the opposite direction of the polling so far. I worry that people like Klain are interpreting the 538 model as saying Biden's polling is fine, when it isn't really saying anything about the polling. Now, my understanding is that at some point, perhaps after Labor Day, the polling will begin to have more influence on the 538 model. I've frequently seen Morris cite this chart, for instance. Polls move a lot in the fall. Expected change in the presidential candidate vote margin in state polling averages from 1948 to 2020 by the number of days before Election Day. So in other words, what this chart is showing you is that G. E. Morris thinks that polls don't matter until roughly about 150 days before Election Day and really start mattering about 50 days before Election Day, about 60 days before Election Day. It really starts to change rapidly and become more accurate. Now, here's the thing. Then you shouldn't say it's the 538 polling model, and you shouldn't publish it until 60 days before Election Day. Because right now, it's not based on any evidence that we have. Basically, the chart says, okay, so here he goes. Basically, the chart says the polls don't tell you very much until about 75 days. Okay, I said 60 based on the chart, but it's 75, which is right here instead of right here. It's fine, whatever. Roughly late August, at which point they begin to rapidly converge toward what they're going to say on Election Day. This still isn't a reason to favor fundamentals over polls, because the fundamentals are even less reliable according to 538's calculations. But I'll leave that aside for now. I also don't really buy the chart, and I think it badly exaggerates the amount of polling movement we're likely to see. Why? Two reasons. One is that it's based on state polls, not national polls. State polling averages are much more noisier for various reasons, mostly just because each state will only get polled a few times a month, or sometimes much less than that. Much of what a state polling average captures is just statistical noise, not real movement in the race. The error is going to be much less if you use the sort of fancy polling averages that 538 or Silver Bulletin do, which can combine state and national polls to give you a much more precise snapshot of the race. For instance, if there were 2 or 3 polls in West Virginia in the 1976 election before Jimmy Carter or Gerald Ford, and they bounced around a lot, I don't think that tells us very much about the current environment. The other problem is that their estimates of polling movement are derived from polls since 1948, but polls now are much less swingy than they once were. Let's distinguish two concepts, as we did in the Silver Bulletin model. First, there's how much the polls will move between now and Election Day. This is what we call drift in our forecast. And second, there's uncertainty to how well Election Day polls will capture the actual result, what we call error. Does that make sense to everybody? There's drift and there's error. Do you guys get what I mean? Like, error is how close to the bullseye are the polls, and drift is how much the polls move. Election day error can be fairly high, as it was in 2020 when polls considerably underestimated Donald Trump. However, in a time of extremely high polarization, drift is much less than it once was. The polls hone in toward their final margin earlier since few people's votes are actually up for grabs. In some elections like 2012 or in this year, in fact, the polls barely move at all. Even things like felony convictions or debate disasters or assassination attempts. And this is the issue, is that Donald Trump has maintained a solid and continuous advantage over Joe Biden. It's actually widened since the debate, but it's for the most part been small and consistent. As a result of these assumptions about polling movement, 538's model is extremely uncertain about much of anything at this stage. For instance, they say that Biden has a 14% chance of winning the national popular vote by double digits. Our model says the chances of that are just 1.4% instead. Note the decimal place. So in other words, what Nate Silver is basically saying is 538 is run by an amateur who is bad at his job. Or in Pennsylvania, 538's 95th percentile forecast covers outcomes ranging from roughly Biden by 18 to Trump by 17. This is almost certainly too wide of a range. And it yields some weird artifacts. For instance, 538 has Texas as the third most likely tipping point state, more likely to determine the election outcome than states like Michigan and Wisconsin. How come? Well, I presume it's because Texas has a lot of electoral votes. And if you have as little faith as Morris does in the polling, a model is going to default to that because we know exactly how many electoral college votes Texas has, 40, while the polling is more uncertain. He's so fucking incompetent. Oh my God, what a dumb fuck. Holy shit. I legitimately, I like almost feel bad for G. Elliott Morris because he's so incompetent. But then I realized how this nepotism baby, fucking dipshit, white piece of shit, got this job based on tweets. And how much credibility he's been given by taking on the 538 fucking title onto himself, like he built it. And he doesn't even know what he's doing. He's like cribbing the homework of somebody who actually understands the homework and getting all the credit as an A student. Like actually a piece of garbage. I also think their model gives Biden too much credit for being an incumbent in a polarized era where the incumbency advantage has considerably diminished. But that said, that isn't that much of a difference. My fundamentals model has Biden favored the popular vote by 2.5, whereas Morris has him ahead by 3.3. I mean, that isn't much of a difference, but in such a polarized era, I actually think giving someone an extra 0.8 points is a lot and is kind of determinative. God. The bigger difference is Morris treats the fundamentals as a strong prior, and I treat them as a weak one that you should be pretty eager to disregard once you get enough polling. And I think one should be wary of strong priors in data-poor environments, only one election every 4 years, like election forecasting. Models based on fundamentals have a poor out-of-sample track record, not doing much better than a random guess. They also can't account for factors like Biden's age that are potentially highly material. Sure, the Titanic might seem like it's capsizing, but what you don't understand is that White Star Line has an extremely good track record according to our fundamentals model. That is exactly right. You and I are seeing the Titanic with a huge hole in its side taking on water after hitting an iceberg. That's the Biden campaign. And everybody telling you, but the Titanic can't sink, is the engineers who are like modern liners can't sink. As the boat is sinking, they're saying it can't happen. As I wrote in the piece that introduced the silver bulletin forecast, there's a fine line between an objective statistical model and just some dude's opinion. All models inescapably include some degree of educated guesswork, but the 538 model falls somewhere along the wrong side of this line in my view. This is something that I talked about the other day when I was ripping it apart, which is basically like the fundamental stuff is arbitrary. The fundamental stuff is stuff they made up. They said, oh, this seems important, and put it in. And maybe they even back tested their model against previous elections and said, haha, see, our model was closer to the result than the polling average that year was. So therefore, our model must be good. And here's the thing. That is going to cause overfitting. Maybe certain fundamentals are more important in certain elections. Like if housing prices are affordable and financing costs are low, maybe housing costs don't matter that much for people's votes. But maybe when housing prices and housing costs and a housing crisis gets to a certain level, it suddenly jumps up to be number one. And that's hard to backtest because there's so few presidential elections. It's hard to actually determine what fundamentals are the operative fundamentals in the election. Do you get what I mean? And the problem that I have is if you're using fundamentals, there's no way to know if those are the right fundamentals to use. It's arbitrary. It's a guess. And to say that and then to have your whole forecast rest on those fundamentals is basically, as far as I'm concerned, fucking malpractice. It's basically just Morris's opinion that incumbency is still a powerful advantage and you shouldn't look at the polls until after Labor Day. He's entitled to those opinions, although I think he's wrong on each of those points. But intentionally or not, he's designed his model in such a way as to be nearly impervious to contrary evidence. And that's why it fucking sucks. Don't use 538. It is worthless. All right. Well, there you have it. 538 is fucking worthless. I can't believe I'm defending Nate Silver. I really can't believe it. I used to really, I mean, he's being honest. He's being honest. What I really didn't like about Nate Silver is his punditry sucks. But this is where he's good. Analyzing models and explaining to them what the risks are. And he has opinions, and I disagree with his opinions frequently. But this analysis, you can't disagree with it. It's dead on. Oh, look at that. There's a spike for Donald Trump. He's at his all-time high. 45.2%. That's his all-time high all year. Jeez.
She has no idea who Mike is.
Mike. I don't know who you are. I don't know where you are. But you may want to start changing your ways. Change your ways. We're changing your